What I'm going to tell you now are real storytellings from cemeteries, so sit down and get your popcorn.
I've never been one to believe in things that can't be explained. I've always believed that everything, one way or another, has a cause. But there's something I learned early on working with death. Not everything that disappears is gone, and not everything that's buried remains. And if you have the courage to listen to the end of what I'm about to say, perhaps you'll think twice before setting foot in a cemetery again. My name is Ethan, and this was supposed to be just another temporary job. After I got out of the army, I went through some rough patches, and when the job for a gravedigger came up in Greystone Hill, a small town in the interior of North Carolina, I accepted without a second thought. It was a quiet job, they said, almost always at night. The cemetery was small, surrounded by dense forest that made noise even when the wind wasn't blowing. It had an old chapel, a musty office, and a silence that seemed alive. On my first night, I was immediately given a burial. A boy, 9 years old, Eli Turner death by smoke inhalation in a house fire. There was almost no one at the wake, just the mother, sitting in the back, her face covered by a black veil, without shedding a single tear. That struck me. It wasn't sadness. It was something else. A kind of paralysis, as if she'd buried her son before. I performed the burial in a fine drizzle that hadn't stopped since dusk. The smell of wet earth and the sound of shovels sinking into the clay created a strange, almost hypnotic, rhythm. When I finished, I left a white flower on top and returned to the office with a feeling I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't peace either. Before leaving, I looked at the headstone again. It had a painful simplicity, just the name, the dates, and an empty space, as if someone had forgotten to write something there. At that moment, I heard a subtle noise, like the tinkling of glass rolling across the floor. I turned, looked, and there was nothing. At the time, I thought it was just fatigue, but that was the first of many times that the name Eli Turner gave me goosebumps all over. And that same morning, when I returned to the cemetery, that's when everything began to fall apart. If this story has captivated you this far, it's because it deserves to be heard until the end. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way, you'll help these voices never be forgotten. I returned to the cemetery early, as per protocol. The light rain from the previous night had stopped, but the ground still exuded that thick smell of soggy earth mixed with the artificial perfume of the plastic flowers surrounding the oldest headstones. I walked to the new block, where the boy had been buried. I hadn't intended to stop there. The plan was simply to check the back gate, which often got stuck with accumulated mud, but something pulled me in that direction, as if the silence were calling me back. Eli's grave was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing out of place. No sign of tampering. Not a single flower disturbed. But something was wrong. The grass seemed drier around his grave than the others, as if the ground had absorbed the night's moisture only there. I thought it was strange. Instinct took over and I went to the storage room to get the coffin key. Something we only use in specific situations, but I wasn't leaving with that feeling gnawing at me. I slowly unlocked the lid, expecting to see the boy's body as I had left it. His face serene, wrapped in white. Linen, his hands crossed over his chest. But when I lifted the lid, the emptiness froze me. There was no body, nothing, no clothes, no sign of decomposition. The coffin was completely clean, dry, and in the center of it, resting alone, was a blue marble, shiny, as if it had just come out of some child's pocket. I backed away, unable to think. My heart was pounding as if it were trying to escape my throat, and everything around me grew darker, more muffled, as if the whole world had held its breath along with me. My first reaction was to think of theft, desecration, some damned lunatic, some ritual, anything that made sense. I ran to the guardhouse to check if anyone had entered during the night. But the recordings were intact. The cameras pointed at the gates and the main entrance. No sign of forced entry, no suspicious activity. I called the supervisor, trying to hide the panic in my voice, and explained what I'd seen. His response was quick and curt. "Don't tell anyone about this. Just close the coffin and leave everything as it was." His coldness chilled me even more than what I'd encountered. It wasn't surprise, it was control. As if he already knew, as if this had happened before. I walked back to the tomb, closed the lid slowly, but couldn't leave the ball inside. I took it with me without thinking why. Maybe because it was the only proof I wasn't going crazy. But it was when I got home that night and watched the security camera footage that I realized what I was. Facing went far beyond anything I'd ever seen, because what appeared there in the 4:17 a.m. video shouldn't exist. The cemetery's camera system was old, with low-quality continuous recording, but it worked well enough to capture any suspicious activity. That night, before leaving my shift, I did something that was perhaps my greatest success, or my worst mistake. I manually copied the file from the previous night onto a personal flash drive and took it with me, hidden deep in my jacket. In pocket, something told me that recording held answers no one wanted to reveal. I arrived home shortly after 9 o'clock. The house was dark and silent as usual. I sat at my desk, plugged the flash drive into my laptop, and started watching. The images were static, cold, like any surveillance video, the cemetery shrouded in light fog, the trees moving slowly in the wind, and Eli's headstone there, motionless as it should be. The clock read 3:48. Nothing happened. For over 20 minutes. There was only silence and shadows dancing with the streetlights. But then, at 4:17 in the morning, something changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The earth in front of the headstone seemed to vibrate slightly, as if it had become lighter or more alive. At first glance, it might have looked like just lens distortion, but as I progressed frame by frame, I saw it clearly. The topsoil had moved from the inside out, as if something was pressing underneath, trying to get out or pass through. There was no break, no hole, no visible opening, but the pit's outline trembled with a wavering that wasn't caused by the wind. And then, in the lower left corner of the screen, something flashed by. A small shadow, too short to be an adult, walked silently behind a mausoleum. It was quickened but clear, and most disturbing, it seemed to jump, like a child at play. I rewound the recording. I watched it again and again. Each time I saw that shadow passing, I felt my skin crawl, as if icy hands were pressing against the back of my neck. And then I noticed an even more disturbing detail. Exactly 1 second before the shadow's image appeared, every low sound echoes through the system. A kind of muffled, almost imperceptible laughter, like the sound of a child having fun, coming from far away. I stood there, staring at the screen, as if waiting a few more seconds would make sense of it all. But the video ends shortly after, with a brief glitch. The screen flickers, distorts, and returns to normal, as if nothing had happened. I closed the laptop slowly, feeling my entire body stiffen. This wasn't a technical error, and there was no way anyone else could have gotten in there without leaving a trace. That shadow, that laugh, they didn't belong on this side of reality. But what really made me doubt my sanity was what happened the next night, when I decided to return to the cemetery with a tape recorder hidden in my pocket. And I heard, with my own ears, that laughter right next to me. The next night, the rain returned, fine and steady, as if the sky itself were hesitant to reveal what lay hidden behind that tomb. I knew going back there was insane, But I also knew that if I didn't, I'd never find peace again. Something inside me had already been opened, just like that coffin, and part of me needed to see for myself that I wasn't making it all up. So I slipped a digital recorder into my pocket, hidden under my coat, and went. I arrived around 2:20 in the morning. The cemetery seemed even darker than on other nights, even with the streetlights lit. The fog hung heavy, low to the ground, and everything seemed slower, as if time were dragging along with me. I walked aimlessly, pretending I was there just for a regular stroll. But deep down, I knew exactly where my feet were taking me. I passed the back of the chapel near the side parking lot. That's when I heard it. A high-pitched, quick sound, and yet too strange to be just an echo. It was laughter. A childish laugh. A short one. The kind of laugh a child makes when they're up to something in secret, as if they're enjoying a secret. My body froze. I looked around, but there was no one. Absolutely no one. The wind blew against the back of my neck, and at that moment the laughter repeated itself, louder, closer, but still invisible. I began walking slowly, trying to control my breathing. The laughter seemed to move around me, now to my left, now behind me. It wasn't constant, it was playful, as if the thing, or whoever it was watching me, testing me. As I approached the parking lot exit, my hands already shaking and cold sweat running down my back, something stopped me. There, in the middle of the exit passage, was a small blue ball, exactly like the one I'd found inside the coffin. It sat there, motionless, perfectly centered, as if it had been left there by someone who knew I would return. I didn't touch her. I couldn't. I just stared, and for a second, I swear I heard her. Rolling, even though she hadn't moved, I ran. I didn't look back, not that night. But what awaited me the next day, inside the cemetery archives, would make that laughter seem like nothing more than the whisper of a cruel joke compared to what I would soon discover. I spent the entire next day feeling like that little blue ball was still following me, even though I'd left it behind. Every corner of the house seemed to echo that muffled chuckle. Every shadow seemed to stare back at me. But it wasn't fear that dominated me. It was need. The feeling that something needed to be discovered, as if the truth had been buried for years, and only now had someone started digging. I returned to the cemetery before business hours began. The administrator's office was in the back, behind the chapel, with an old wooden door that creaked every time it opened. I waited for the supervisor to leave to inspect the side wall, and then snuck in. I rummaged through the main drawers, where the records of recent burials were kept, but the name, Eli Turner, simply wasn't there. There were burial records that week, different names, everything normal, but no Eli. As if the burial had happened, but had never been recorded. I accessed the old archives in the microfilm room, a forgotten relic that few knew how to use. And there, amidst dust and typed files, I found something that truly made my blood run cold. A yellowed file with the same cursive writing from the 1990s, Eli Turner. Age 9. Died. 1993, cause of death, house fire. Funeral held on April 17th in the same lot where I buried that boy days ago. Same name, same age, same cause, same location. My heart hammered in my chest as if it were trying to break through the bone. I ran from the room and went straight to the old section of the cemetery, which was on the other side of the hill. There, among abandoned tombs and moss-covered graves, I found the original headstone. There it was. Eli Turner, 1984, 1993, buried for 30 years. Everything matched, except the fact that I'd seen the same boy buried again. I despaired. I grabbed a shovel and started digging. The earth was light, almost loose, as if someone had disturbed it recently. When I opened the tomb, I found no bones, no coffin, just a hole. and inside it dozens of blue marbles scattered across the bottom as if someone had spilled a bagful of them. Some were scratched, some cracked, and all looked as if they had been used for a long time. It was as if each marble told a story, or each marked an apparition. In that moment, I realized Eli wasn't just a lost boy. He was part of something repeating itself, something ancient, something that was still happening. And perhaps the scariest thing was knowing he wasn't the only one. After that night, I was never the same. I quit my job 2 days later without explanation, without looking anyone in the eye. I packed my bags, left Greystone Hill, and tried to move on, as if it were all just a strange chapter in my life. But some things don't stay buried. Some stories follow you, even when you try to forget. I moved cities, I moved states. I deleted the photos from my phone, formatted my laptop, and threw away the flash drive with the recording. I did everything possible to erase every trace, but what I couldn't erase was the sound of that laughter. Because it kept coming, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes in the middle of a dream, and worse, sometimes while I was awake. The first time I noticed it was with me was in a coffee shop in Tallahassee, Florida. I ordered a black coffee, sat at the corner table, and when I went to open my napkin, there she was, a little blue ball, alone, as if it had found me, as if it knew exactly where I would be. I thought it was a coincidence. I forced myself to believe it, until the next day I found another one on the hood of my car, and the following week another one inside my backpack, always blue, always clean, always looking at me as if it had eyes. I've tried talking to others, telling them what I saw, but it's as if no one can hear me through. Someone always interrupts me, a cell phone always rings, a noise outside always distracts, as if something is protecting this story from being told, or punishing those who try to expose it. So I decided to record this story, put it all here, every detail. Because if anything happens to me, you'll know. And if one day, for any reason, you hear a child's laughter when there are no children around, don't follow the sound, don't try to understand, don't look around, just walk away and never ever touch the ball. Now, if I can ask you just one more thing, answer me here in the comments. Have you ever found a little blue ball without knowing where it came from? Because if so, maybe it didn't start with me, maybe it never stopped, or maybe it's just starting now. There are things we see at work and learn to let go. It's the easiest way to move on when you deal with death every day. But on that shift, something refused to be buried. Something that was too quiet, too clean, and yet it seemed to be waiting for me. It was an ordinary Monday in Brookfield Memorial, an old cemetery in the interior of Ohio, surrounded by pine trees and silence, the kind of place where even the wind moves slowly. I'd worked there for over 2 years. Nothing surprised me anymore. Discreet burials, repetitive protocols, flowers that wilted as quickly as the names on the tombstones were forgotten. That morning, I arrived early as usual. Coffee in hand, to-do list on paper, radio tuned to the local news. The town was calm, the world was normal, and that was exactly why the break in routine frightened me so much. During the inspection round, I noticed something that at first glance seemed ordinary, a headstone with the grass around it slightly sunken in. But there was something about that image that chilled me inside. The earth wasn't disturbed, but it had a fresh feel, as if someone had moved it without leaving a mess. I approached slowly. The name engraved was Charles H. Barlow, death registered 5 days earlier. But something didn't add up. The coffin was down there, that was certain. The problem was that it was open. The lid was slightly displaced, fitted but not sealed. No signs of forced entry, no signs of vandalism, no dirt spilled inside. Clean, stable, calm, and at the same time, everything inside me screamed that this was wrong. I called the caretaker, the assistant, and even the funeral director from last week. They all said the same thing. They couldn't remember anyone named Charles Barlow being buried. One of the gravediggers even said, "That name sounds made up, man. We haven't buried anyone like that." Looking at the tombstone once more, I felt something I couldn't quite name, a sort of displacement, as if I were in the wrong scene. As if I'd wandered into a movie that was already halfway through and someone had deliberately edited out some parts. But it was when I returned to the office to check the registration system that I began to understand that this wasn't just an oversight. It was as if time itself had skipped a line. And whoever was lying in that coffin, perhaps they hadn't been placed there by living hands. I went straight back to the main office, that cramped room that smelled of old wood and stale coffee. I opened the funeral home system, the same one I use every day to enter dates, names, times, and grave locations. I searched for Charles H. Barlow. Nothing. I tried his last name. I tried the date. I tried variations. Nothing. It was as if that name had never been entered by anyone, as if he'd been buried by accident, or by someone who didn't want him found. I began to sift through the manual records, the physical records we still traditionally keep, stored in grey boxes in the steel cabinet. But the week of the 12th simply skipped straight to the 14th. 2 entire days' worth of records were missing. No burials, no movement, no signatures. And that didn't make sense, because I was certain I'd seen a funeral that morning, days ago. I even remember the black hearse, the uniformed pallbearers, the woman in the dark blue dress holding a bouquet too small for the occasion. I went back in time, mentally. I relived that morning as if I were inside myself again. And I swear by all that is holy, I saw that burial happen. But when I went to check the surveillance cameras, I found only static, a 37-minute gap, right at the exact interval when the burial would have taken place. The previous images were intact. The later ones were too. But that specific space seemed to have been erased, not by a technical glitch, but by someone who didn't want it to be seen. With my heart racing and my head spinning, I went to the surveillance department. I spoke to Kenny, the maintenance guy. He looked at me as if I were drunk. He said that not a single camera had malfunctioned that week. No maintenance protocols were in place, and according to him, there hadn't been any burials scheduled for that location in the last 10 days. I returned to the headstone. I reviewed the name, Charles H. Barlow. I picked up the radio and called the municipal hospital, asking for information on recent deaths with that name. The operator on the other end replied coldly, "That name hasn't been in our records since 1972. The call ended shortly after without allowing me to ask any further questions. I looked back at the grave, and for the first time I felt like it was looking back. I can't explain why, but I had the impression that the headstone was in a place that wasn't hers, as if it had been moved from some obscure spot in the cemetery and placed there, as if trying to go unnoticed, hidden in plain sight. It was then that something occurred to me, a strange thought, but one that stuck in my mind, like a silent warning. What if it wasn't the name that had disappeared from the records? What if it was the dead man himself who should never have been remembered? That night, I went home, unable to eat. My head whirled between dates, blurry images, and the name of that grave no one seemed to recognize. It felt like I was stuck in an old riddle, the kind with no solution, only more questions. But that wasn't what kept me awake. What kept me awake until 4 in the morning was a simple, almost childish question. How could a headstone appear out of nowhere in a guarded, registered cemetery surrounded by walls and iron fences? I returned early the next day. It wasn't even 5:30 in the morning when I entered the north field where Charles's grave lay. The sky was still dark, with that bluish hue that precedes sunrise. Dew lay heavy on the grass. I walked to the exact spot where I'd seen the headstone yesterday, and what I found was just grass. No mounds of earth, no stones, no names, nothing. I'm not saying someone removed the headstone overnight. There were no signs of movement, no footprints, no disturbed earth. There was simply nothing there. And as crazy as it may seem, it was as if had never existed. I ran to the administrative office to reread the cemetery maps, the block markings, the row number, the lot, the exact coordinates. And once again, Charles H. Barlow was nowhere to be found. That part of the land, according to the system, was empty since 1986. I grabbed my flashlight, returned to the spot, and began digging with my bare hands, half on impulse, half out of desperation. When I reached less than a foot deep, I knocked on wood. It was a piece of a coffin, and there it was, the same coffin I'd seen the day before, only now sealed, completely covered in earth, and judging by its position, it had never been opened. I backed away, my body trembling. I sat on the floor, took a deep breath, and tried to find any logical explanation. Could it have been a dream, a hallucination? Was someone playing a trick on me? But as I tried to calm myself, I heard a sound, a soft, metallic clink, as if something small had fallen near my foot. I looked down, and there it was, a blue marble, exactly the same as the one I saw inside the coffin the day before. The problem? I never told anyone about it. I didn't even mention that little ball out loud, but it was there, as if someone was listening to me think. I finished that shift with my entire body aching, but not from the physical exertion. It was as if something was draining me from within, silently, as if each step into that cemetery cost me a part of my sanity. Before leaving, I left the flashlight in the tool closet and checked the aisles of tombs one last time, as I always did. It was an old custom, almost ritual, a way to end the shift with the certainty that everything was in order. But that night, nothing seemed in order. I closed the main gate, locked it with the old iron padlock, and headed for the parking lot. It was empty, as always. My car was the only one there. The streetlights flickered with that annoying frequency, casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt. I walked slowly, my head still heavy from everything that had happened, when I heard it. A laugh. I froze. It wasn't an ordinary laugh. It wasn't someone on the phone, nor the sound of a forgotten cell phone. It was a childish laugh, light, as if a child were enjoying something. But at the same time, there was something about it that made my entire neck stand on end. It was as if it had come from a place too ancient to still exist, as if it had echoed from the depths of some memory that wasn't mine. I looked around, but there was no one, no movement, no sound beyond the hum of lamps and the rustling of distant leaves, and then it was again, closer, clearer, as if playing behind me. I spun around reflexively, my heart catching in my throat. Nothing. The silence returned like a cold wave. And that was when I saw it. Leaning against the back of my car was a figure, small, from the back, dark clothes, short hair. She looked like a child of about 8 or 9. I stood still. The first thing that crossed my mind was, what kind of child would be alone in a cemetery at 11 at night? And why? I called out. My voice barely left my mouth. Hey, everything okay? She didn't answer. She just turned her head slowly, as if she knew there was no need to rush. And then she smiled. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile that seemed to understand more than it should. A smile from someone who wasn't there for the first time. I blinked, and she was gone. She didn't run. She didn't vanish with dramatic effect. She simply wasn't there anymore, as if she'd never been. I opened the car door with trembling hands, got in, slammed the door, and took a deep breath. I tried to rationalize. Could it have been a hallucination? Stress? lack of sleep, but the moment I started the engine and the headlights came on, something glinted on the ground in front of me. It was round, blue, and it was rolling slowly toward me. The marble, the same one, again, as if it were a warning. After that night, I couldn't go back to the cemetery without feeling a weight on my chest. The kind of weight that doesn't come from ordinary fear, but from a kind of presence that seems to walk alongside us, even when there are no footprints on the ground. I spent the next few days in silence, trying to find an explanation, something that would convince me I was overreacting, losing my mind, until something pushed me to reach out to someone who perhaps had been through it before. I remembered old Hank, a retired gravedigger who'd worked in Ravenhill for over 30 years. Living secluded in a wooden house about 20 minutes away, he was always described as a reserved, somewhat grumpy but respected man. I decided to visit him one cloudy afternoon, carrying a bottle of cheap whiskey, hoping it would open his mouth more than my insistence. When I arrived, Hank gave me that look of someone who's seen too much. I didn't ask how he knew it was about the cemetery. He simply pointed to the porch chair and said, "Sit down. If you're here, something's calling you." I froze, and before I could even mention the marble, the child, or the headstone, he said something that made my stomach churn. It was the boy's grave, right? The one with the laugh. I remained silent. My mouth was dry. Hank took a deep breath, took a drag on his cigarette, and began to tell me. He said that in the 1980s, a boy named Jesse Holloway was buried there. 9 years old. Died by drowning. His mother swore he'd been pulled into the lake by something that lived there. The body wasn't found until a week later, and even then the boy's face was strange, as if he'd smiled at the final moment. Since the burial, things started happening. I myself covered that coffin with dirt. I saw it sink. I saw the coffin close, and I swear to God, the next morning the grave was the same as before. No one moved it, no one went there, but the boy wasn't in there anymore. He looked into my eyes, and there was a blue marble in place of a heart. My hands were shaking. It wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't an illusion. It was as if history were repeating itself, as if the boy were coming back, or had never left. I asked him why he never said anything, and Hank simply replied, "Because when you talk too much, you start to be overheard by people who shouldn't be listening." At that moment, a thick silence enveloped us. One of those silences that carry something within, as if someone nearby was holding their breath to hear better. And before I could say goodbye, Hank slowly stood up, put his hand on my shoulder, and said something I'll never forget. "If he chose you, then it's too late." Returning to that cemetery after my conversation with Hank was like signing a contract I hadn't even known. I'd accepted. It felt as if I'd somehow already been summoned by something far beyond my understanding, and now there was no turning back. I carried a weight on my shoulders that wasn't just psychological, it was spiritual, as if the very earth of that place was silently awaiting my presence. I arrived around 10 o'clock at night. The air was denser than usual, though the sky was clear, and the iron gate, always heavy, seemed to give way all too easily, creaking with a sound that echoed not just in my ear, but in some forgotten part of my chest. With each step between the rows of tombs, the air around me seemed to tighten. The trees in the background, motionless, seemed to watch. The headstones took on more grotesque shapes in the gloom, and the silence wasn't the usual silence of the early morning, but a kind of charged silence, one that screams without sound. Even trying to avoid it, my feet guided me to the boy's grave. And before I knew it, I was already standing before it, intact. Clean as if it had been dug and closed the same day. No sign of tampering, no wilted flowers, but there was something off. The earth seemed to move, not visibly, not trembling, but there was a pulse there. a subtle breathing, a life where there should only be death. Then I heard it. At first, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the scraping of small nails on wood. Soon after, something more definite. Marbles rolling. Lots of them. And they weren't rolling on the floor, but as if they were hitting each other beneath me. And then came the laugh, short, childish, and its echo went straight to a memory I didn't even remember having. It was at that moment that I realized I wasn't there by chance. The thing inside that cave didn't want to leave. It wanted me in. Without knowing why, my steps led me to the old tool shed, a place never usually used at night. The door was ajar. The air inside was stifling, as if the air had been overused. The hanging light bulb flickered with disconcerting slowness, and at the back of the room, on a table covered in dust and old stains, sat a small iron box. The lock was already broken, as if someone wanted to ensure it would be opened. Inside the box lay dozens of blue marbles, each marked with a date and a hand-engraved name, children's names, old dates, and between them an empty space, a space that seemed reserved. Held together by frayed tape was a yellowed piece of paper with a name that knocked me off my feet. Mine. I closed the box instinctively, not even realizing my hands were shaking. I stumbled, knocking things over, scratching myself on the corners of the wall, and ran to the parking lot as if I were being followed by something I didn't dare look back at. When I reached my car, I gasped for air like someone coming out of a drowning. But before I got in, something inside me forced me to turn my head. And there, among the graves, he was. Jesse, standing, motionless, watching me with a slight smile on a face like someone recognizing an old friend. And around him other children appeared, one by one, silent, impossible to count. Not one of them blinked. The next morning, I quit. I made up excuses about health, stress, anything that could justify my sudden departure. No one objected. No one objects when a gravedigger leaves. I spent the next few months avoiding anything that reminded me of that cemetery. I moved to a town in rural Kentucky, trying to rebuild some peace. But last night when I opened the front door of my house, there was something on the floor, a small box. Inside, a single blue marble. And most disturbing of all, it was cracked, as if it had been used or returned. I always thought the scariest sound in the world was a shovel digging at night. But that early morning in Ravenhill, what chilled my bones wasn't the noise. It was the silence. A silence that only appears after something has been awakened. The storm that struck that night didn't feel like an ordinary storm. Lightning ripped across the sky as if trying to tear the fabric of the world. And the thunder didn't sound like thunder. It trembled differently, as if coming from within the earth rather than from the sky. Trees bent as if trying to escape something. And there I was, inside my wooden cabin, with the lights flickering and the TV off, with the absurd sensation that someone, or something, was passing outside, skirting the windows. It wasn't my first night as a gravedigger in that cemetery, but it was the first time the weather seemed to conspire against my sanity. Ravenhill is a small town in southern Mississippi, where everyone knows everyone else's business. Except what happens. In the cemetery, that early morning, I didn't sleep a wink, and as soon as day began to break, I took advantage of the break in the rain to do the standard inspection. With the ground still damp and the fog covering the graves like a dirty blanket, I walked slowly among the headstones, checking to make sure everything was in place. Until I saw the coffin. It was a new white model, still adorned with flowers from the previous day's funeral. But what held me there, my heart pounding in my chest, was the fact that it was out of the grave. That's right. The coffin was resting on the grass right next to the grave. closed, intact, as if it had never been opened or buried. No drag marks, no holes around it. Just it there, still, as if it had come out on its own. But the worst was yet to come, and you'll understand why when I tell you what there was, or rather, what there was inside it. I approached with slow steps, inhaling the damp, earthy scent mixed with the artificial perfume of the still fresh flowers. The coffin seemed too clean to have been removed from the grave. No trace of mud, no sign of violence or intervention. It was as if it had been gently left there, as if someone had placed it there with their own hands and then disappeared without a trace. Even fighting against my better judgment, something inside me pushed me forward. An unbearable need to understand what lay before me. I placed my trembling hands on the lid, and after a moment of hesitation, that seemed to last an eternity, opened it. I don't know what I expected to find. Perhaps a disfigured body, a sign of desecration, some invading animal. But what lay inside was emptiness, a clean, intact, unmarked void. No sign of violence, no tissue, no trace of the child who'd been buried the previous afternoon. Nothing, except a small object gleaming in the dim morning light. A blue marble. It lay in the center of the coffin's white lining, motionless, as if it had been left there. On purpose. This unsettled me in a way I can't even explain, because I remembered it clearly. During the funeral, while the family wept and the pastor recited prayers, the body was there. I myself had helped seal the coffin. The child had a name, a story, a mother who nearly fainted when she saw the lid close. And now, everything was gone. Everything except that small artifact that seemed to mock my disbelief. A little ball, blue, shiny, childish. Such an innocent detail that made everything even more macabre. I tried to find some rational explanation, but each attempt was overwhelmed by a nagging feeling that something invisible was watching me. The atmosphere around me felt dense, as if the air had thickened. The birds that usually sang in the nearby trees were completely silent. The once steady wind had suddenly stopped, and there, standing beside that empty coffin with a marble at the bottom, something inside me knew I wasn't alone. I closed the lid and stepped back slowly, looking around more closely. It was then that I noticed. The ground beside the grave, the one where the coffin should have been buried, was slightly bulging, as if instead of someone digging out, something was trying to get out. A small, barely perceptible rise, but real. And before I could process it, I heard a sound coming from the parking lot, like a child had just laughed. And that laugh wasn't new. For a moment I froze. The sound of that laughter still echoed in my ears like an ancient taunt. It wasn't just a childish giggle, it was something more. There was a hidden layer to it, as if mockery mixed with suffering, as if the child was having fun, but at the expense of something that shouldn't have happened. I turned slowly toward the parking lot, but it was empty. The wind, once still, now rushed through the trees, and the leaves danced as if trying to warn me of something. But there was no one, no cars, no children, no sound other than the nervous rustling of the vegetation, and the rapid beating of my heart. Trying to cling to some logic, I decided to go straight to the surveillance room. Ravenhill Cemetery was old, but it had been modernized in recent years due to some vandalism. I knew we had security cameras at strategic points, including those facing the section where the boy had been buried. I walked with long strides, almost tripping over myself, as if trying to overcome my fear with haste. I crossed the small hallway that led to the monitoring room and sat in front of the monitors. I needed to see for myself what had happened during the early hours. I fast-forwarded through the previous night's footage until I found the moment the coffin was buried. Everything was as it should have been. 4 men digging, me among them. The coffin was in place, flowers were placed, soil was filling the void. Everything was perfectly normal. But when I fast-forwarded to the early morning footage, something changed. On the screen, around 3:27 a.m., the camera, pointing directly at the area, began to experience some kind of interference. Horizontal lines crisscrossed the image, as if a magnetic field were distorting everything, but I could still see the soil, and what I saw made me flinch from my chair. The earth was moving, not as if someone were digging from the outside in, but as if the ground itself were breathing, as if it were pulsing. And then, in a single moment frozen in time, something I couldn't identify, seemed to push the earth. From the inside out, a shadow, a human form, but shapeless, rose from the ground like thick smoke and disappeared from the lens within seconds, as if it had never been there. The camera returned to normal shortly thereafter. No alarms went off, no sensors detected movement, and strangest of all, the other cameras continued to function perfectly. Only that one was affected, the one pointing directly at the boy's grave. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. I re-watched the recording 4 times, trying to find technical flaws, reflexes, any explanation that could bury that absurdity back in logic. But there was none. What I saw was real. And it was at that moment that something made me look at the glass door of the room, because, reflected there, right behind me, something small and blue was rolling slowly on the floor. And that's when I realized I wasn't alone in that room. I turned around, my heart pounding, feeling a strange heat creep up the back of my neck as if my skin were trying to escape its own body. There was no one there, no child, no visible presence, but the little blue ball, the same one I'd seen at the bottom of the coffin that morning, was now at my feet. Still, but with a strange vibration in the air around it, as if the room had changed just because it was there. And I swear, by all my sanity, that I heard, behind all the silence in the room, a muffled whisper. I can't say what it said. I only know it didn't seem to come from outside, but from inside my own head, like a memory that wasn't mine, but was trying to infiltrate. I picked up the ball with trembling hands and, on an almost irrational impulse, left the monitoring room. I needed to talk to someone. Anyone who had been at that funeral, someone who had felt the same discomfort. I remembered the cemetery gardener, Mr. Dalton, a soft-spoken man, a Navy veteran who always avoided discussing funerals, but who that day lingered a little longer than usual near the child's grave. I picked up my cell phone and called. No answer. I tried twice more, until the 3rd time he answered, but he didn't say anything. He just breathed on the other end of the line, as if struggling for words. I asked him if he remembered the boy's funeral from the day before. There was a silence that lasted longer than it should have. When he finally answered, his voice was low, as if he were afraid of being overheard. He said he did remember, but he couldn't get out of his head the fact that he'd seen the same little blue ball before the funeral began. It was on the lawn next to the still fresh headstone. He thought it was odd, but assumed it was just a souvenir someone had dropped there. But, he said, the ball seemed to move on its own, as if the wind was pushing it in a specific direction, back into the hole. When I told him about the body's disappearance and what I'd seen on the cameras, his silence turned to panic. He began speaking faster, saying that around 3 in the morning he'd dreamed about the boy. A vivid dream, with smells, sounds, everything, and the boy didn't ask for help. He laughed. He laughed and pointed to his own mouth, missing teeth, too many teeth. A grotesque detail that Dalton made a point of repeating. His teeth were all the same, as if he had several smiles crammed into his mouth. When he woke up, his hand was covered in dirt. He thought it was just his age, a freak out. But after what I told him, he said he needed to get out of town. That he'd seen this kind of thing before when he served in the Gulf, and that certain dead people don't want rest, they want an audience. And before I could ask what he meant by that, the call dropped, and my phone completely froze. On the darkened screen, for just a second, I saw reflected a face that wasn't mine. That night, the cemetery felt different. And I don't say that because of the silence. This place has always been silent. It was something else, a kind of anticipation in the air, as if the ground was waiting for something, as if it knew someone would return, and that someone was me. I returned alone, even after everything, driven by a restlessness that wouldn't let me sleep. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to see with my own eyes what was inside that tomb now, or at least confirm that it was still empty. I entered through the side gate with my headlamp on, avoiding any noise. The fog was thicker than usual, almost pasty, as if trying to stop me from moving forward. Each step sounded louder than the last, and at some point even the sound of my feet was swallowed by that suffocating silence. The boy's headstone stood in front, intact, no flowers, no digging marks, but the earth was warm. That's right, warm to the touch, as if something had just been buried or unearthed. I knelt down and began digging with my hands. Madness, maybe, but something inside me needed to see for myself. And that's when the flashlight blinked. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. A pattern, a code of sorts. And then everything went black. Darkness swallowed me completely. I couldn't even see my own hands. The smell of damp earth intensified, mixed with something I only later recognized, sulfur, or blood, or both. It was at that moment that I heard footsteps behind me. Light, short steps, like a barefoot child walking on wet grass. I froze. I couldn't turn around. My entire body froze, but the sound grew closer, 1 step at a time, until it stopped. Just behind my left shoulder, and then a breath, faint, quiet, but definitely present. I felt the cold air brush against my skin, and suddenly a laugh, that childish, sadistic, strangely joyful laugh that had haunted me from the beginning. But now, it wasn't coming from my head, it was coming from someone there with me. And before I could scream, run, or react, something touched my neck. A cold, small touch, like a child's hand. But what chilled me to the bone was feeling a second touch. Then a third, then a fourth, as if several hands, too small to be human, were surrounding me and preparing to pull me in. I don't know how long I stayed there, kneeling on the warm earth, with those invisible hands touching me. It could have been a minute. It could have been an eternity. I only remember that at some point, everything disappeared. The sound, the touch, the presence, vanished as if they'd never existed. But they left something behind, something inside me, not physical, not visible, but real. A constant feeling that I'm no longer alone, that I've brought with me, a part of that cemetery, or something that lived there. I've never told this whole story to anyone. People say it's just trauma, stress, exhaustion. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and the strangest thing is that ever since that day, I've started finding blue marbles in the most unlikely places. In my car, in my coat pocket, even inside the kitchen sink. Always just one. Always the same shade of blue. As if someone were leaving a trail. As if you wanted me to know that you're still around. Sometimes I still hear laughter at night. I don't know if it's memories or reality, but it doesn't matter. Because once you dig the wrong grave, once you look inside and don't find what should be there, some part of you disappears too. And what's left is never the same again. If you've made it this far, you might think this is all just a story, an exaggeration, a fabrication. But if you ever find yourself alone in a remote cemetery and hear a child laughing where there shouldn't be anyone, remember what I told you. And if you happen to find a little blue ball lying on the ground, don't touch it. Just walk away and pray it wasn't left for you. If this story has captivated you thus far, it's because something within you felt the weight of this story. So subscribe to the channel now, because there are still many secrets hidden beneath the earth that I need to tell you. And some are still alive.